Good afternoon and welcome to the PlanIt webinar series. My name is Raya Smiley and I will be facilitating the webinar today. This is the fourth event in the 2016 Basics webinar series. PlanIt is the Council's effort to provide educational opportunities for the 2040 Comprehensive Plan update process. PlanIt not only includes the webinar series, but also involves workshops, seminars, and conferences. We are also expanding the local planning handbook's online resources with a series of online tutorials and expert articles on all items related to comprehensive planning. We will be introducing new resources continuously, so you may want to check the online resources regularly. If you have any questions during this presentation, please post them by using the webinar's control panel. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we will answer as many of your questions as possible. You may want to keep the control panel open throughout the presentation so you receive any announcements made during the webinar. Also, there are two handouts available for you, a fact sheet on transitways and a transportation resource sheet. Today's session is Transportation Overview. We will be talking about the basic requirements of transportation planning as it relates to your local comprehensive plan update. The topics will cover everything including forecasted growth allocations by transportation analysis zones, highways and transitways in the plan that need to be reflected in local plans, the new regional bicycle transportation network, and requirements for communities impacted by airports. Let me briefly introduce you to the presenters for today's webinar. Mark Philippi.
Hello and welcome to the webinar.
Is the Manager of Technical Planning Support in MTS at the Metropolitan Council and works on travel demand forecasting, air quality modeling, and performance measures. He serves on the Technical Advisory Committee to the Transportation Advisory Board. In place of Paul Hineker, Mike Larson will be presenting today. Mike.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Is a senior planner and sector representative at the Council, working with communities along the Metro Green Line and Blue Line extensions. He is also the project manager for the Transit-Oriented Development Guide and serves on the Technical Advisory Committee to the Transportation Advisory Board as well. Mark, I'll turn it over to you to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Raya. We will be covering transportation topics today. First, an overview of the Transportation Policy Plan. Second, an overview of each mode of the Transportation Policy Plan and how that relates to the comprehensive plans that communities are required to update. As we go, we'll be mentioning some of the resources available to communities as they proceed in their comprehensive plan updates. And at the end of the presentation, those resources will be listed. The Transportation Policy Plan is multimodal in structure, covering roads, transit, bicycling, walking, and aviation. The Transportation Policy Plan is required by both state and federal law. The federal law requires a plan be updated every 4 years and be fiscally constrained. The plan has both a current revenue scenario, which meets the fiscal constraint requirement, and is limited to including transportation improvements that the region can reasonably expect to afford, given anticipated revenues. The plan also includes an enhanced revenue scenario to show how additional revenue might be used to improve the region's transportation systems. The comprehensive plan updates, due by the end of 2018, are responding to the system statements that were distributed in September 2015. Because of the 4-year federal cycle, the next TPP update is scheduled to be adopted by early 2019. Communities are encouraged to monitor that plan as it is developed, to consider if language in your update for 2018 can also address the 2019 TPP update. This would allow communities affected by the update of the regional plan from having to revise their newly adopted plan. Here is an illustration of the highway projects that are in the fiscally constrained current revenue scenario. The current revenue scenario is the basis for the road and transit improvements that are in the system statements provided to each community. If a community wishes to include alternatives or scenarios on the regional transportation system that go beyond the TPP fiscally constrained scenario, It may do so. However, the community plan will need to clearly indicate that the local alternative is not to be implemented with regional revenues. All metro communities have previously adopted comprehensive plans, most of them updated in 2008, that reflected the transportation system already built as well as regional transportation policy plan that was in effect. So many of you already have a very good start on your new plan. There are certain items that are required to be in the transportation plan element of a community's comprehensive plan in order for the plan to be found complete for review and in conforming to regional highway, transit, and aviation systems. Today, we will focus mainly on the new or updated elements of the TPP that you will need to include in your plans. All of the requirements can also be found clearly listed in the local planning handbook. We will also be having future sessions on transit planning, bikes, and transit-oriented development, where you will have the opportunity to learn much more detail on specific topics. The first area we will review covers highways and roads, a topic area that affects all the communities in the region. We will begin with a discussion of the designation of the functional class of the roads within a community. The primary aspect of the different classes of roadways is the balance they exhibit between mobility and local access. The highest class of roadways are the principal arterials. These are best typified by the interstate system, though they can also be state highways or county roads. The primary role of a principal arterial is to provide mobility around the region, rarely providing direct local access to local land uses. They typically carry longer distance trips. The next class of roads are the minor arterials. These may be state trunk highways, but are more often county roads or major city streets. While this class of roads still provides a good bit of mobility for users of the system, they also begin to provide direct local access to land uses located along them. Collectors tend to be the minor county roads and major city streets. They tend to provide more local access than mobility and serve as a connection between local streets and the higher class roads. Cities and counties have not been required to classify roads in this category previously, but recent changes in federal reporting requirements now require the Council to include collectors in the regional's functional classification system. As such, some of the roads currently classified as local system roads may be reclassified as collectors in this comprehensive plan update. The lowest road classification is a category with the largest number of lane miles by far. This is the local system. The primary role of these roads is to provide access to the local land uses located along them. More detailed information regarding the classification criteria and characteristics can be found in Appendix D of the TPP. The functional class of all existing and proposed roads is one of the minimum requirements for your plan to be found complete. Minor arterials are further divided into 5 classes: augmenters, relievers, expanders, connectors, and other. Other minor arterials were previously referred to as B minor arterials. Mobility and land access are equally important on the collector road system. The collector system provides connections between neighborhoods and from neighborhoods to regional job concentrations and local centers. It also provides supplementary connections between major traffic generators within regional job concentrations. Collectors are further subdivided into major and minor collectors based on the length of trips and the density of development served. Consult the local planning handbook to see the classification of your community's roads as currently depicted in the regional records. Because the function of a road is so closely related to its design and its surrounding land uses and density, the function of most roads is very stable over time, and the functional classification map in your community's current plan may need only minimal changes. Please remember that changing a road's classification in your comprehensive plan is not sufficient to ensure that the change is actually made. The functional classification system is reviewed and approved by the Transportation Advisory Board, the TAB, through its Technical Advisory Committee, the TAC. Requests for changes to a road's functional classification must be submitted directly to the TAB through the TAB coordinator, Elaine Kotsukos, so TAC can review and approve any minor arterial and collector changes you wish to put into your updated plan. Many other elements are required for your plan to be found complete, as listed here. For clarification, ADT is average daily traffic, and HCADT is heavy commercial average daily traffic. Both of these may be found on the MnDOT website. You may ask why you are required to show changes to principal arterials that are in the TPP. There are two reasons. First, to ensure that local planning activities are aware of changes to the principal arterial system and take them into account. Second, to provide a single source for somebody wanting to know what changes to the road system in your community are anticipated. Information on the location of min-pass lanes, dedicated busways, and bus-only shoulders can be found in Chapter 6 of the 2040 TPP. Additional minimum requirements address interchanges, access management, and corridor study integration. Your plan should only include interchanges that have been through the MnDOT Metropolitan Council Joint Interchange Committee review. A list of these interchanges can be found in Chapter 5 of the TPP. Other interchanges may be discussed in your plan so long it is clearly spelled out that they are a local initiative that is not funded with regional revenues and that has not been reviewed by the Joint Committee, that it is being included only as a possible scenario and as a sensitivity test. Travel demand strategies need to be included and analyzed for areas that have high traffic generation. This applies primarily to plans for St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Bloomington. Two of the more technical aspects of your transportation element update are the allocation of population, household, and employment growth to transportation analysis zones and traffic forecasts. The transportation analysis zones, or TAZs, used to aggregate population, household, and employment data were redefined for the 2010 census and for use in the updated regional travel demand model. The number of zones increased from 1,632 to 3,030. In the past, the Council prepared the allocations, but as communities became more involved in project development and realized the importance of getting future growth in the right location, the task of allocating growth was passed to the communities. This allows the communities to use their knowledge of local development pressures and community growth desires to influence the location and allocation of data to TAZs. Beyond just the allocation of data to TAZs, communities are asked to describe how they have allocated that growth based on the plan's guided future land use. Communities with transitways or that hope to have a transitway are asked to show how proposed development densities around transit accommodate the density expectations found in Chapter 3 of the TPP. An upcoming tutorial will be available in September 2016. Will provide information and methods for allocating growth among your community's TAZs. The Council can provide population and household totals by TAZ in your community based on the 2010 census. Likewise, employment data can be provided tabulated from the quarterly census of employment and wages, the QCEW. Though this data may be subject to some data suppression thresholds. The Council can also provide projected future population, household, and employment by TAZ for your community, though this data would need to be reviewed for consistency with new guided land use policies. A tutorial providing more information and methods regarding travel demand forecasts will be available in September 2016. Generally, the method of producing forecasts or projections is dependent on the anticipated growth and level of land use changes expected in the community. For communities that anticipate significant growth and/or changes in land uses, a travel demand forecast model would be the preferred tool to best assess the changes to trip generation and trip distribution resulting from a whole new land use development pattern. In areas that do not anticipate significant growth or land use changes, such as rural townships, and that do not have major roads passing through them, linear projections based on historical data may be sufficient. Though in all cases, review of the outputs needs to take place to ensure the results are reasonable. The 2010 Travel Behavior Inventory updated the regional travel demand model, converting it from the trip-based model that had been used for decades to an activity-based, tour-based model. This new model is currently undergoing sensitivity tests to ensure its validity, but it also is currently being used for project development in the region. Any changes for variance from the standard regional travel demand model must be documented. These changes should be reviewed and accepted by council modeling staff prior to being implemented to ensure acceptance of the results.
Transit is an important part of the regional transportation system. It plays a part in fostering of the region's livability, economic prosperity, and sustainability. It is also important to fostering greater equity in the region, providing access to opportunity for those who rely or depend on these services. Transit includes different types of services including rail, buses, and dial-a-ride. Your comprehensive plan needs to address both existing and planned transit service. We'll provide an overview of planning requirements and emphasize what's new. A webinar next month will cover more detail on transit planning basics, transit markets, and comprehensive planning. Additional resources on encouraging development around transit is included in the Council's new Transit-Oriented Development, or TOD, guide. A workshop on TOD is being planned for late 2016. Today we'll cover three main areas. Transit market areas refers to geographic parts of the region where different types of transit investments and services are likely to be more cost-effective. We'll also discuss how to represent the existing transit system in your comprehensive plan. Finally, we'll discuss how to represent the planned transit system, including considerations regarding land use. Research by the Metropolitan Council shows that there are factors that greatly influence transit use across the region. They include density, both population and employment; intersection density, which represents the interconnectedness of the local street system and, therefore, directness of walking routes; and the number of cars owned by residents. The Metropolitan Council defines transit market areas based on these factors. Each market area is associated with different types of transit services based on demand and their cost effectiveness. Most communities have more than one transit market area. Communities should discuss their transit market areas and how land use planning, as well as pedestrian and bicycle planning, may complement or enhance the market for transit. One important thing to note is that transit market areas can change over time. You will see that some parts of the region are now identified as having a, quote, emerging market area. This identifies areas where growth and change are laying the groundwork for higher levels of transit service. This zoomed-in view of the transit market areas map shows the city of Eden Prairie. Much of the southern portion of the city, shown in light green, is part of Market Area 4, which is characterized by low population and employment densities. These areas are not very well suited for local routes. On the other hand, the city has an emerging Market Area 2 near Eden Prairie Center, where much higher density residential and commercial development has been occurring. This area will be served by the extension of the Metro Green Line and has been the subject of more recent detailed planning by the city. Details about transit market areas and the fundamentals of transit planning can be found in the Transportation Policy Plan and will be featured in next month's webinar focused on transit. Communities should also acknowledge whether or not they are part of the Transit Capital Levy District. This district defines where regular route service is provided in the region based on where communities are contributing local property tax for transit capital. Areas outside of this district are generally associated with Transit Market Area 5, where there isn't the demand for regular transit services. Your comprehensive plan should describe and map both existing and planned transit services and facilities in your community. This includes the following: existing transit routes and dial-a-ride services, existing and potential high-frequency transit routes, existing and planned transit stations and transit centers, existing and planned park and rides and express bus corridors, existing and planned transit advantages, and existing and planned transit support facilities. GIS data for this transit system information is available through your community page on the local planning handbook, as well as from the Minnesota Geospatial Commons. This transit mapping example is from Bloomington's current comprehensive plan. Bloomington used colors and line types to represent different types of service. For example, the blue lines represent an all-day level of service. Two different types of dashes represent light rail transit and express bus service. Red represents service that only occurs during the peak period. If we zoom into the Mall of America, we see how the Bloomington South Loop area has a high level of transit service. This type of approach can be helpful for communities as they consider future development, potential for future transit service, and needs for pedestrians and bicyclists. The TPP includes two scenarios for the future transit system. One is the current revenue scenario, which represents the federal requirement that the transportation plan be fiscally constrained, identifying only projects that can be funded by likely revenues and resources. Communities must include these transitways in their plans. Comprehensive plans should discuss the status of projects that are under development, including planning for potential alignment and station locations. The local planning handbook provides guidance on expectations for communities at various stages of development of the transitway, from analyzing alternatives to construction and operation. Your comprehensive plan should reflect planning work to date, including the incorporation of station area plans and/or planning recommendations that would address land use, bicycling, and pedestrian elements and implementation needs. If a community is at an early stage in project development, it can acknowledge the opportunities and challenges of different alternatives. This handout is also available as a handout in your webinar. For communities that have transitways in the current revenue scenario with an identified mode and alignment, your comprehensive plan now has requirements related to density for residential development. This density requirement applies only to areas identified for new development or redevelopment and is an average across all of these areas. This density requirement varies by mode and by community designation. More information on new land use planning requirements, including policy on levels of activity in station areas, is available from the local planning handbook and will be addressed in more detail in next month's webinar. The TPP also includes an increased revenue scenario that identifies further transit investments if additional resources can be identified. Communities can consider these transitways in their comprehensive plans, but corresponding text and maps must clearly identify these transitways as dependent upon funding that is currently uncertain. We encourage communities to conduct local planning that would support ridership and the cost-effective implementation of these transitways. However, communities should not plan as if these lines were certain. As some final thoughts on transit, we have a couple of examples that show how transit could be shown in context with transit markets, services, and land use. Here is another example from the city of Bloomington, which conceptually shows how different transitways would serve the city. They identify existing, planned, and desired transitways. They show how transit infrastructure and services would serve concentrated and denser centers of activity at Normandale Lake, Pan American, and the South Loop. Here is another approach that may be helpful for the planning process in your comprehensive plan. As shown here with the City of Eagan, your community may wish to show a more detailed relationship between land use, shown on the left, transit market areas, shown in the middle, and transit services, shown on the right. Communities can use this kind of review to explore opportunities to lay the groundwork for improved integration between land use and transit services. We'll now turn our attention to bicycling and walking, which are also important for local trips, as well as making regional connections with regional systems. The most important change in the bicycle planning chapter from previous transportation policy plans is the introduction and designation of a regional bicycle transportation network. For many years, the TPP has included biking as an important regional transportation mode, even though it is not considered a regional system, like transit and highways. The plan contained regional policies promoting biking and walking, but no specific map of a regional system of bike facilities. Due to the relatively short length of these trips, the region previously relied on local units of government to plan specific routes and facilities. However, with the rising popularity of biking as a transportation mode, a regional bicycle system study was conducted in 2013, which resulted in preparation of the Regional Bicycle Transportation Network, or RBTN. In addition to adopting this network, the TPP also provides the background on how this vision of a bicycle network for the region was developed. This RBTN is not fiscally constrained since there is no dedicated funding for bike facilities like there is for roads and transit. However, bicycle and pedestrian facilities can be funded with federal funds allocated by the Transportation Advisory Board, so the plan does offer guidance for prioritization criteria to be used for the regional solicitation. The goal of the RBTN is to, quote, establish an integrated and seamless network of on-street bikeways and off-road trails to most effectively improve conditions for bicycle transportation at the regional level, and to encourage planning and implementation of future bikeways by cities, counties, park agencies, and the state. Since there is no one agency charged with developing or owning this network, and no one funding dedicated to this network. This is what the RBTN vision looks like as adopted in the 2040 TPP. Council staff worked closely with cities and counties to determine where there were bicycle facilities already existing or planned in a corridor that could be designated as an alignment for this network. These alignments are the narrow lines on the map. The map also shows broad corridors where a bicycle facility is generally needed, but specific alignments have yet to be determined. These corridors are like, quote, search areas. The corridors are a half-mile wide in the core cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and a mile wide in outlying suburban and rural areas. You will also notice that the corridors are prioritized into two tiers. The intent is that development of Tier 1 would provide a basic regional skeletal system, but filling in with Tier 2 corridors would be desirable to serve all of the regional bicycle trip needs. The intent of the RBTN is to serve as a backbone arterial network to serve the daily bicycle transportation needs. It would connect regional destinations, but it is not intended to replace local bicycle facilities, which will still be needed for shorter, more localized trips. There are a number of anticipated benefits from the planning and implementation of the RBTN at both the regional and local level. Most importantly for local planning agencies, the RBTN can serve as a guide for making cost-effective investments in bicycle facilities by extending the reach of community networks through connecting to and completing segments of the RBTN, and also by completing missing links and breaks in the continuity of facilities between jurisdictions. The TPP continues to support bicycling and walking through policies as well as through the RBTN. You can find the regional goals and objectives and supporting strategies for all transportation modes in Chapter 2. but on the screen here are the ones most closely related to bicycling and walking. You may wish to incorporate these objectives and strategies as you prepare local plans. Minimum expectations for local bike plans will be to describe and map your community's existing and planned on-road and off-road bike facilities, map and describe all RBTN corridors and alignments within your community as they relate to your local networks. And for your assistance in developing these maps, we have been working closely with each of the 7 counties to compile a new regional bicycle system inventory. This regional database will be made available to agency planners later this year via Metro GIS Data Finder and will be especially helpful in finding how you can link your facilities to those in adjacent communities. If you have bicycle facilities data for your city and have not been in contact with your respective county, please contact Met Council planning staff to ensure your data will be included in this regional database. More specific details and resources for developing these RBTN maps will be provided in a future online tutorial in early 2017 and in a webinar scheduled for later this fall. So stay tuned for more information about these events. As was just noted when we talked about bike planning, the TPP has for many years recognized walking as an important regional transportation mode, even though it is not considered a, quote, regional system. Average length of these walk trips is quite short, so there is no specific regional network or plan. Local units of government are the most appropriate level to plan specific routes and facilities. Pedestrian system needs should be considered in the context of your community designation. For instance, rural communities with low densities and large distances between destinations would probably have minimal discussion of walking or pedestrian facilities in their plans. However, for more densely developed communities that have many destinations within walking distance, walking can be an important mode of transportation, as well as a way to connect to transit. So a more extensive consideration of walking would be warranted in your comprehensive plan. The Local Planning Handbook and Chapter 7 of the TPP include more information on several potential walking elements your plan could address, such as sidewalks, safe street crossings, connections to transit stops, lighting, ADA sidewalk design, and safe routes to school.
As previously mentioned, the Aviation System Plan is required by state law. The Regional Aviation System consists of 1 commercial service airport, Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, MSP, 1 intermediate airport, St. Paul Downtown Airport, and 6 minor airports, Air Lake, Crystal, Lake Elmo, Anoka Blaine, Flying Cloud, and South St. Paul, with Forest Lake being a turf runway airport. There are 2 private seaplane bases in the region that need to be considered in local planning. The addition of any new airports to the system by 2040 is unlikely. Communities near airports have been aware of and managing airport impacts for years. The main focus in the region is to preserve and manage airports, and most capital investments will be for maintenance and safety, although some land-side expansion, such as new gates and parking, is anticipated at MSP. One change to be aware of in this 2040 TPP is that many of the specific policies and strategies about aviation land use and noise compatibility, such as the FAA requirements for tall towers, are now in Chapter 2, Transportation Policy Plan Strategies, rather than in their previous TPP location in the Aviation Chapter. All communities should protect the region's general airspace. This includes objects that affect the navigable airspace. Local governments should control structures above 250 feet to minimize airspace intrusions. This should be reflected in the comprehensive plan update. We are not aware of any major changes in seaplane operations since the last comprehensive plan update. However, if you have a lake in your community, you should check with MnDOT Aeronautics to see if the lake is considered a landing area for seaplanes. If so, that should be noted in your plan. Helicopter operations can occur in conjunction with many different land uses and locations, such as hospitals or law enforcement sites. If your community anticipates issues with helicopter operations, you may wish to prepare and adopt ordinances for heliport sites. A few communities, like Brooklyn Park and Farmington, host FAA navigational aids that need to be protected. But these facilities have not changed since 2008, so if this affects your community, it should already be in your plan. There are a limited number of communities that are directly impacted by an airport. The 2008 plans for those communities already reflect the region's airports, but communities should revisit whether an airport's plan, or LTCP, updated since 2008, might have changed the noise and other impacts on land uses around the airport. Every regional airport must periodically update its long-term comprehensive plan, commonly called the LTCP. Lake Elmo Airport and South St. Paul have updated airport LTCPs in the last 3 to 4 years. Crystal Airport and Air Lake Airport will have completed their updates within the next year. Much of the information required for the community's comprehensive plan is found in the airport long-term comprehensive plan. Therefore, communities should integrate the airport planning process with the community planning process. Finally, we will discuss how comprehensive plans should consider the movement of freight in local communities. Freight, like people, moves by various modes, each accommodated with its own system of infrastructure. All communities need to consider trucks moving over the regional highways and local roads in the transportation element of their plans. Trucks are the predominant freight mode nationwide. They also provide the critical local movements of goods arriving to the Twin Cities via other modes like rail, barge, or air. Rail intermodal terminals are of statewide importance and should be identified and planned for good truck access. Access to other intermodal transfer facilities like river ports or MSP Airport should also be addressed in the local comprehensive planning process. First, major freight distribution centers or intermodal transfer facilities should be identified and mapped, as well as industrial manufacturing sites and major retail centers. Then planners should identify any local roadway issues or problem areas that may impact through truck routes or direct access to those important freight centers. It is important to identify both through truck routes for full-sized semi-trucks as well as local access routes that provide the critical last-mile connections to freight destinations. Local plans may consider including data on such factors as pavement structure and condition, lack of connectivity between freight nodes and the Metropolitan highway system, also known as the first and last mile connections, or geometric issues such as insufficient bridge clearances or tight turn radii at intersections. The implementation of a complete streets design solution for a roadway needs to include the movement of freight as a need to be met, as much as pedestrian or bicycle movements in those areas where truck traffic is prevalent. Lastly, in many communities, redevelopment is mixing non-residential and residential uses together in ways that has not been seen for decades. First-floor retail, especially restaurants, in multi-story residential buildings may introduce the need for truck access in areas that may be built to be walkable with narrow streets. Again, all users of the street need to be reasonably accommodated.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have a few things to mention before we move on to questions. Here are a few of the links to resources that may have been mentioned during the presentation today. The Local Planning Handbook in particular is a key resource for comprehensive plan updates. The PlanIt page has the most current information available on upcoming events, we encourage you to sign up to get notifications when new opportunities become available. We also post notices for other regional events that are informative about comprehensive plan topics. Other resources here listed here direct you to the Transportation Policy Plan and the Minnesota Geospatial Commons, where you can download GIS shapefiles for your mapping purposes. Now we have time to answer a few questions. Before we start on that, we have another technical expert in the room, Connie Kozlak.
Hello, everybody.
Is a retired manager of Metropolitan Transportation Services who is currently working part-time as a transportation planning analyst. Now, the first question is, oops, sorry. So what if a county is proposing something that is not in the TPP? Does the community then need to show that as part of the increased revenue scenario to be consistent with the county plan?
The Metropolitan Council reviews plans for consistency with our transportation policy plan and the material that was submitted to the communities in their system statements last year. We do not review it for consistency between jurisdictions, though certainly we hope that the two jurisdictions do talk to one another, and they are required to be submitting their comprehensive plans to one another. But we will be looking at the city and the community comprehensive plan update for consistency with the transportation policy plan, not the county plan.
Yeah, one thing I would add is that if the counties are including facilities that are not part of the current revenue scenario, that they're probably working with local cities, and that it would be helpful to collaborate and have it be consistent with the county's plan.
You mentioned earlier the TOD density required for areas identified for redevelopment. Who identifies that?
I'll take that question. It is cities that identify locations for new development and redevelopment in their comprehensive plan. Cities allocate growth by TAZ, and then they guide the land uses at various density ranges. The TPP establishes a minimum residential density expectations for areas near transit stations. However, this applies to only locations that the city has identified for future residential growth and redevelopment. Furthermore, not all residential development needs to meet this minimum. When we evaluate this, we'll look at an overall average. Some areas could be lower, some could be higher, depending on context that happens through the community planning process. I do want to also note that in addition to minimum density, the TPP also has identified targeted ranges which are higher and which we encourage the cities to explore. The minimum expectations really are intended to preserve the market for future housing near transit, and as well as to ensure that the transit system is effective at connecting people with destinations in the region.
Great, thank you. Now the RBTN map shows many of the corridors and alignments overlap regional trails. What does this mean for requirements for coordination with the park implementing agencies?
This is Mike. I'll take that question again. Planning and implementation of the RBTN will require coordination between the various levels of government that may have jurisdiction over over the alignment or parts of the alignment, or over a search corridor where different levels of government and different stakeholders will identify more specific alignment. So that's, yes, that would include the regional park implementing agencies for segments that overlap with the regional trail network, and we would strongly encourage collaboration between your community and the park implementing agency. We'll have more of a chance to discuss this in greater detail and related issues in the our webinar on the RBTN in October.
Great, thank you. Are all the service improvement plans a part of the current revenue scenario? The city has been told that certain routes are being considered for expansion and increased frequency, but we don't know what routes will be expanded or increased in frequency. So how do we include the transit information in our plan?
Metro Transit Service Improvement Plan, or SIP, requires additional revenue that Metro Transit does not currently have. The SIP identifies opportunities to add new routes to increase the frequency and span of service on existing routes through the year 2030. However, Metro Transit also continually evaluates the effectiveness and the efficiency of the existing system. This could result in changes to or improvements in service. The best ways that communities can support transit and to improve transit service with the existing resource constraints that we have is to understand the potential for changes in service, to understand the fundamentals or conditions that make transit cost effective, and to engage the Council and Metro Transit during the comp plan process. Communities that build a better foundation for transit will be stronger candidates for improvements regardless of the funding scenario.
Great, thank you. So this is a question for Mark. You noted noise issues from aviation sources. My community has issues with road noise. Does the TPP offer potential solutions and funding sources for that?
Road noise is governed and regulated by state and federal regulations. When there are improvements to a road, there's a very well-defined process by which MnDOT has to review the improvements and the impacts on noise, and then is what is to be done to mitigate and minimize the noise impacts. It involves a very heavy public involvement process, a voting process by landowners and residents along the affected area where they decide whether or not noise walls are to be implemented. So there's a process. There are funds available through the regular funding procedure for projects to deal with noise so that it can be dealt with.
Great. So another question relates to transit. We've been told that making local roads transit ready will increase our likelihood of receiving and increasing better transit. Can we include these proposed bike and ped improvements in our plan to show commitment to transit through our facilitation of higher ridership through bike ped improvements and future land use changes?
Yes, you could, and you encourage you to do so. Making the road network friendlier to biking and walking are certainly supportive of transit. The likelihood of specific increases in service or altogether new service will also depend on other things as well. And these would include your transit market area, the potential impact on demand that the specific efforts that your community have on transit demand. For example, something that's also very important is the amount and density of development that is within walking distance or bicycling distance. So that is also very important as well. Again, I really encourage communities that are interested in pursuing these improvements to be in touch with us through the sector rep program. We can also connect you with Metro Transit service planners to have a discussion about maybe details of the SIP or service improvement plan that I had mentioned, as well as the possibility of adjustments. We certainly appreciate the interest and can explore the feasibility of these based on the support that your community is providing.
So another question related to funding. What are some funding mechanisms if a community wants to construct a local bike trail system? Is there any?
I guess that's me again. I'll take
Unless
that.
you.
Huh? Feel free to contribute. Well, I have some ideas about that. The funding is much more available if the trails have a regional role. Projects that incorporate portions of the RBTN or connect to the RBTN are eligible for regional solicitation funds. However, Safe Routes to School is another funding category through the regional solicitation. So that could be used if the local bike training trail plan had a focus of connecting children with schools. Use of state aid funds is another possibility along state aid routes in your community. That doesn't increase the amount of state aid funding. It just, you're allowed to use that funding for trails. And of course, city property tax levy is another option. I don't know, Kai, if you can think of any other resources, it's kind of more localized.
No, I think you covered it pretty well, Mike. The only other thing that's a funding source for bike trails in general is the routes which are shown on the regional trails plan as part of the regional parks network are eligible for the typical park funding sources as well, but only those road trails.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. I have a clarifying question about the first question that I asked with being consistent with the county plan. So if a city does not include the county's increased revenue scenario ideas, will their plan be considered incomplete and thus not get approved?
Well, as I said in the original response, the communities are responding to the information they were provided in the system statements that the transportation policy plan is testing against the current revenue scenario, the fiscally constrained scenario, so that will be the test for consistency. If a community submits a plan that is consistent with the transportation policy plan findings, that will be what we'll be looking for.
So it sounds like the short answer to that is no.
No. Yes, I guess that would be the short answer.
I think the thing people need to think about is showing any increased revenue project in their plan is an option. It's certainly not mandatory. As Mark said, the current revenue scenario is the plan that people will be held to. And so if they choose to show any increased revenue project, either on their own accord or because it's in a county plan, they need to be very clear that this is not a project that the region is planning to fund or build.
Thank you. Is there a minimum density or minimum intensity requirement for non-residential sites along transit-oriented development? For example, is there an FAR minimum, the floor area ratio?
Yeah, I'll take that question, Ryan. No, there's no FAR requirements per se for non-residential development or other measure of density for non-residential development near transit station. One thing that that I touched upon briefly during the presentation that I can briefly talk about now, but that will be covered in next month's webinar as well, is the TPP's activity level policy, which encourages communities to plan in a way where the station area becomes a focal point for growth in the community. And as part of that policy, we suggest a minimum benchmark of at least 7,000 people, students, or jobs. Many existing transit stations already pass this threshold. We encourage communities to think long-term, encourage more intensive uses of land around transit stations, and to inform their stationary planning with market studies, for example, that could shed light on the potential for station areas to become focal points of activity. So we'll evaluate that 7,000 level is a benchmark, but throughout the planning process, communities can explore what the potential might be for the stations in their community. And again, we'll discuss this in greater detail in how this policy will be applied in next month's webinar.
Great, thank you. You mentioned minor airports, but can you elaborate a little on reliever airports? Honey?
I think I can take that one for you since Russ is out of town this week. Basically, all of the minor airports are reliever airports. A reliever airport is basically any regional airport that is not MSP. Our commercial airport would be slowed down serving our commercial uses if we had a lot of general aviation and business aircraft coming in there. And since under the federal rules and Constitution, we aren't allowed to ban those airports, we try to develop the reliever airports to be an attractive enticement for those types of aircraft to keep them out of the traffic flow at MSP. So basically any minor airport plus downtown St. Paul, which is considered an intermediate airport, would be part of our reliever airport system.
Great, thank you. So there's an airport in our community, but most of the airport is located in the adjacent community. Should we just let the adjacent community address the airport?
Can you take that one?
I'll take it. If there's an airport in your community, you have to address it, whether it's just a little bit of it or all of it. So don't ignore it because it's just a corner of the airport.
Okay, great.
I guess if I could elaborate on that a little bit, one of our most important concerns is how you deal with land use around the airport, because the airport typically will impact that adjacent land use. And so even if a community is not at all within, or an airport is not at all within your community, but is very close by in an adjacent community, you probably should be looking at what kind of impacts that airport might have on your land uses in your community.
Great, thank you. This will be the last question we have time for. What is the difference between the RBTN and the Regional Trail Plan shown in the Council's Regional Parks Policy Plan?
Well, Ray, I'll take that question. If I didn't explain that very clearly in the presentation, the RBTN is primarily a transportation network, and the network of regional trails are primarily a recreational system. However, during the planning process, and I think as many people recognize, because many of the regional trails provide very good uninterrupted connections across the region. And they work very well and have been used as transportation routes for bicyclists. So consequently, we do have parts of these systems that overlap. And fortunately, we have another webinar. So we have a webinar scheduled on the RBTN. So, you know, a greater distinction between these facilities and funding sources and process will be covered there.
Great, thank you. If we didn't get to your question today, please feel free to contact Mark, Mike, or Connie, as you can see on this page. They will be happy to answer your questions directly. Now, I'd like to mention just a few logistics for our participants and pass on information on some upcoming events the rest of this summer and beginning fall, actually. Please join us for the next presentation in the PlanIt Basics webinar series. On September 15, Jan Youngquist and Michael Paterka will be discussing Parks and Trails planning. Also, the Transit Planning Basics and RBTN webinars are planned for the months of September and October, respectively. Registration is now open and available on the PlanIt page of the local planning handbook, so be sure to check that out. If you'd like to review today's presentation again, we will be posting the video on the PlanIt page of the local planning handbook. We will also provide the Q&A document for you, and this will include the questions that we didn't get to. And finally, we will prepare an annotated PDF of the PowerPoint slides for the website as well. And all of these will be posted within the next week. And to wrap it up, as you exit the webinar, there's a short 5-question survey. Please take just a minute to help us out with that. And if you have any other questions or comments, please contact us. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.